The town was engulfed in silence, with no one roaming its streets except for Khaled. He walked briskly, carrying a shoulder bag filled with enough food to last him several days, a flashlight, the book given to him by the old man, and a few papers and pens, just in case he needed to jot something down. He saw no need for a camera, as his phone was more than sufficient. Khaled headed toward the edge of town, where the abandoned house stood. As he neared its towering wall, he steeled himself for the challenge ahead. Meanwhile, his grandfather sat alone, reading the holy book, praying for Khaled's safe return. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted his solitude. Hope sparked in his eyes. Was it Khaled coming back? But as he opened the door, he found Mona standing there. He was taken aback to see her at such a late hour. "Where's Khaled?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Why isn't he answering his phone?" Her grandfather's expression turned curious. "Why?" Mona's face lit up with excitement. "Grandpa, my father finally agreed. Khaled and I can get married. I couldn't wait until morning to tell him. I was afraid my father might change his mind." The old man smiled, but said nothing. Khaled climbed over the wall of the abandoned house, turning on his flashlight as he reached the spot his grandfather had described in detail. Without his guidance, finding it would have been nearly impossible. There it was, the large rock blocking the way. He tried pushing it aside, but despite his strength, it wouldn't budge. He tried again and again, frustration mounting. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he clenched his jaw and pressed forward. "I won't give up," he growled, determination flaring in his eyes. His gaze landed on an old wooden plank nearby. Maybe this could help. He wedged it under the rock and pushed with all his might. His muscles strained, his breath came in ragged bursts, and he let out a final guttural cry as the rock shifted just slightly. That small movement was all he needed. Little by little, he forced the rock aside, revealing a rusted iron door beneath it. His knees buckled, and he collapsed for a moment, catching his breath. "You did it, champ," he murmured to himself, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "And this is just the beginning." Gathering his strength, he placed his hands on the iron door and whispered a prayer. It wasn't locked by anything other than the rock, so it creaked open with a long, eerie groan. He shone his flashlight inside and saw a vertical ladder descending into darkness. "Here we go," he whispered, steeling himself. Carefully, he climbed down. The moment his feet hit the ground, the door above slammed shut. He spun around, realizing the wooden plank that had kept it propped open had broken. No turning back now. Focusing on what lay ahead, Khaled pressed forward through the underground passage, his flashlight casting long shadows. Thick spiderwebs clung to his skin as he brushed them away with his free hand. Step by step, he moved deeper into the tunnel, but then his breath hitched, his chest tightened, the air was getting thinner, his heart pounded faster. He needed to find the corridor to the underground chamber, but it wasn't there. His vision blurred as he gasped for air, panic creeping in. He stumbled forward, hands skimming the tunnel walls, searching, desperate for an opening. Nothing. "Where is it?" he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. He knew he wouldn't make it back up the ladder. He'd suffocate before he could even try. He sprinted now, wild and frantic, scanning every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. His legs gave out, and he collapsed. His flashlight slipped from his grasp, rolling across the ground. With his final breath, he let out a weak, broken whisper. There is no passage, there is none. Then he fell silent, tilting his head to the side, nearly closing his eyes as if surrendering. But then he looked into the distance, toward a spot illuminated by the lamp lying beside him. A faint, exhausted smile appeared on his face as he spoke. FOREK Tunnel. He closed his eyes for a moment before opening them again, his gaze falling on wooden planks stacked together, revealed in the glow of the light. They formed what looked like a small door on one side of the tunnel. The wooden door was just a few feet away from Khaled, but he was still lying on his back, too exhausted to move. Then, with a sudden jolt, he forced himself forward, crawling toward the door like a reptile, unable to stand on his feet, struggling for breath like a drowning man. He dragged his body forward, pushing with his feet, pulling with his arms, gripping the lamp between his teeth. He kept pushing himself, telling himself this was hope. This was FOREK Tunnel, where air awaited him, where life awaited him. He whispered words of encouragement to himself as he inched closer and closer to the door. With one last push of his foot, he propelled himself forward until his body gave out again. Only a few feet remained between him and the door. His eyes locked onto it as he stretched his arm toward it, but his fingers failed to reach. His arm fell limp as if surrendering, until he suddenly let out a desperate scream, gathering every ounce of strength he had left. He threw his body at the door like a rock hurled through the air. The old wooden planks, weakened by time, shattered under the impact, and he tumbled through. His body plunged downward, crashing onto a wooden staircase. Eyes shut, he rolled and tumbled down step after step, unable to control his descent. He hit the steps repeatedly, falling deeper and deeper, until finally the motion stopped. He opened his eyes. Khaled found himself sprawled on one of the wide stone steps, his lungs filled with air, and it felt as if he had just drunk from a well after unbearable thirst. A wave of relief swept over him as he realized he could now see everything without the aid of his lamp. The darkness of the tunnel was gone. He staggered to his feet and let out a victorious shout. "I'm in FOREK Tunnel! I'm in FOREK Tunnel!" His eyes darted downward. There were still more steps leading deeper into the unknown. Excitement surged through him as he hurried down, his bruises and pain no longer mattering. He wanted to see everything before the moon disappeared. He told himself that everything written in the book had been true so far. The air was real, and the moonlight was illuminating his path, as if amplified by the tunnel's structure. What an incredible feat of engineering! But one question lingered in his mind. What did the book's author discover? Reaching the bottom of the staircase, Khaled stepped into a massive tunnel, far larger than the one he had passed through earlier. The ceiling soared nearly 10 meters high, and the tunnel was just as wide. He moved forward, his eyes widening with amazement as he studied the colossal stone walls. It felt like a hidden archaeological site. Taking out his notebook, he scribbled down notes, capturing every detail. How could such a tunnel exist beneath my town? He wondered, with only the book's author and a handful of people knowing about it. If this is real, then this might be the greatest discovery of modern times. My town could become a famous tourist destination. A thought struck him. Perhaps the book's author had discovered the tunnel itself. Khaled moved forward, overwhelmed with excitement, laughing uncontrollably. The pain had vanished. Maybe he would even find treasure here. He eagerly examined every corner, determined not to miss a single detail. Then suddenly, his foot struck something, his heart jolted, he looked down and froze. A skeleton, a human skeleton. It was the first time he had ever seen one, but it wouldn't be the last. As he ventured deeper, more and more skeletal remains appeared along his path. A creeping fear began to seep into his heart. It was as if the skeletons were whispering to him, warning him. This was the fate of everyone who had entered this tunnel. A horrifying thought crossed his mind. Could one of these skeletons belong to his father? His mother? He desperately hoped it wasn't true. Then something else caught his attention. The light was fading. The brightness behind him was dimming. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was nearly 5 a.m. The moon was setting. Panic gripped him. According to the book, the tunnel remained lit only while the moon was visible. But what would happen next? The tunnel's glow continued to fade, but Khaled pressed on, unwilling to turn back. He moved deeper into the darkness until he saw something carved into the stone wall. A portrait. It depicted a man with an air of wealth and power. Khaled chuckled, speaking to the carving as if it could hear him. "You must be FOREK." "Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Khaled Hosni, the man who just discovered your incredible tunnel. Thanks to you, I'm about to live the greatest days of my life." He pulled out his phone to take a picture of the carving. The moment he snapped the photo, a violent tremor shook the ground beneath him. He stumbled. Turning his head, his breath caught in his throat. The tunnel walls. They were collapsing. The destruction was coming straight for him. Khaled stepped back a few steps, then realized he had no choice but to turn and run forward. He sprinted as fast as he could, with the collapsed walls chasing him like a predator hunting its prey. He couldn't believe his eyes. It felt like a dream. The sound of massive rocks crashing down echoed in his ears. If even one hit him, it would crush him. His shoulder bag fell, spilling everything inside, but he didn't care. His long legs and wide strides helped him move faster, running toward the unknown. Inside, he screamed, "How do I get back home? Is this the end? The tunnel is collapsing. What happened above?" Then he reached a fork in the passage. Before he could decide, the other path collapsed, forcing him into the only remaining one, as if the destruction itself was choosing his fate. Suddenly, he found himself running up an incline. The collapse behind him sped up, trying to swallow him whole. He struggled against the steep climb, pushing his legs harder. Then he saw it, a bright light ahead, shining like the daylight he knew so well. He rushed toward it, with darkness and destruction at his heels. As he neared the opening, he leaped forward just as the ground beneath him crumbled, sealing the exit shut. It felt like the earth had thrown him out. Khaled landed on the ground, his face buried in the sand. He lifted his head, brushing the sand off his face and eyes. Looking up, he laughed and thanked God, believing he had escaped that cursed tunnel. But when he looked at the sky again, something was different. The blue was clearer and more vivid than he had ever seen. He scanned his surroundings and saw nothing but endless sand in every direction. He stood up, turning around to take in the scene. "Where am I?" he whispered, slapping his forehead in disbelief. "Am I dreaming? How did I end up in the desert?" He spun around again, trying to make sense of his surroundings. There was no one, just an endless, empty desert. He sat down in shock, his eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance, except it wasn't there anymore. It had vanished, as if it had never existed. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. So, the tunnel was just a trap to bring people here? That treasure and that FOREK guy, all a joke? Am I in the eastern or western desert? No. Maybe I crossed the border into Libya or Saudi Arabia. Then he shouted in frustration, almost losing his mind, "Where am I?" Hours passed. Khaled sat there, unsure of where to go. He removed his shirt and draped it over his head to shield himself from the sun. Glancing at his wristwatch, he was startled. It had stopped moving. He didn't think much of it because just then he saw two men running in the distance. His heart pounded with hope. Jumping to his feet, he rushed toward them. As he got closer, he noticed their strange clothing and how sickly they looked, as if suffering from a terrible disease. He called out, "Excuse me, I need your help." But they ignored him and kept running. Khaled chased after them. "Why are you running away?" One of them turned his head slightly. "Can't you see what's happening to us?" Khaled was confused by their odd accent, but smirked, mimicking them playfully. "Oh, yes, I see." Then he asked, "We're in Saudi Arabia, right?" The man looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean, Saudi Arabia?" Khaled exhaled deeply, muttering to himself. "These guys are completely lost." The other man, panting, asked him, "Are you a foreigner?" "Yeah, I'm a stranger here," Khaled replied quickly. "Now tell me, where are we? Who are you?" One of them answered, "We are the poor. We ran away to the desert. Do you have any food?" Khaled shook his head. "No, I had some, but it was in my bag." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a 10-pound note. "I have money. Can't you buy food? Just tell me where I am and how to get home." One of the men snatched the banknote from his hand and ate it. Khaled's eyes widened in shock. "Are you that hungry?" The other man laughed. "You must be a very rich man." Khaled stared at his torn, dirt-covered clothes and his exhausted state. "What kind of idiot thinks I'm rich?" he thought. All it took was 10 pounds for him to believe that. Frustrated, he played along with their madness. "Okay, tell me this. How do you plan to survive out here? What are you running from? And most importantly, where are we?" The man who had eaten the money took a moment to understand the question. "We are the poor. Life in the desert is better for us than in Zekola." Khaled's eyes widened. "Zekola?" The other man looked at him, surprised. "You don't know about Zekola?" Khaled shook his head. "No. Where is this Zekola? All I see is desert everywhere." The man scoffed. "Who in this time doesn't know Zekola?" He turned to his companion. "These rich people always mock us." Then he pointed to a spot in the distance. "It's there, below." Khaled followed the man's hand. "That's Zekola?" The men left him, running deeper into the desert. Khaled moved toward where the man had pointed and kept walking until he found himself at the edge of a high plateau. Looking down, he saw a vast city with a breathtaking view from above, its sturdy buildings intertwined with lush green spaces that resembled farmland, along with stretches of water. His eyes widened in astonishment. How can such a city exist right next to this barren desert? He wondered. Before he could think any further, one of the two men shouted at him again, "Don't go to Zekola! Stay away!" Then the man ran off with his companion. Khaled didn't pay them much attention. Instead, he kept gazing at the city below, questioning where in the world he had ended up. Where was this land of Zekola? A faint smile formed on his lips as he looked further down and spotted a long paved road leading to the city. The road twisted and turned, rising up toward a plateau he was standing on. He had no choice but to find a way down to it. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, making him even more desperate to reach the city. So he began his journey across the desert, heading toward the road. At first, he thought it was close, but he soon realized how mistaken he was. The more he walked, the farther it seemed. Was it just a mirage? His doubts disappeared when he saw a horse-drawn carriage moving nearby. He rushed toward it, only to find himself standing on the very road he had seen from above. But the driver didn't notice him and rode away. Determined, Khaled continued walking in the same direction as the carriage. Time passed. The sun stood directly overhead, its heat becoming unbearable. Exhaustion weighed down on him, and the pain from his fall into the underground passage began to return. Still, he pressed on, knowing the road was long, but hoping to reach his destination as soon as possible. He felt as if some kind of hope was waiting for him there. Then he heard a sound behind him. Turning around, he saw another horse-drawn carriage approaching. He waved at the driver to stop, and the man did. Khaled, exhausted, looked at him and said, "I need to go to the land of Zekola." The driver asked, "How much will you pay?" Khaled reached into his pocket, pulled out some paper money, and offered it to the driver, but the man's expression darkened with anger. "Paper?" The driver sneered before throwing the bills back at Khaled's face and leaving him behind. Khaled stood there baffled. "What the hell? Is everyone in this place insane?" he muttered to himself. Not long after, another carriage arrived. He tried again, but the same thing happened. The driver rejected his money and left. Khaled let out a disappointed chuckle. "So this is Zekola, the land of lunatics." He kept walking despite his fatigue. Then, in the distance, another carriage appeared. This one was much larger and looked wealthier than the others, with an elegant design that set it apart. This time, Khaled didn't even bother waving. He decided to keep walking. As the carriage passed by, he noticed a young man about his age clinging to the back without the driver noticing. The young man spotted Khaled and gestured for him to hurry and grab on. Without hesitation, Khaled ran toward the carriage and latched onto its rear, looking at the young man with a grateful smile. "Thanks," he whispered. The young man quickly put a finger to his lips. "Shh! Stay quiet, or they'll hear us." The carriage sped toward Zekola, the driver urging the horses forward. Khaled remained clinging to the back alongside his mysterious companion. He glanced at the young man, noticing his strange clothes. The other boy seemed equally intrigued by Khaled's appearance. As they neared the city, Khaled saw an enormous wall towering before them, almost 5 stories high, adorned with breathtaking carvings. A massive gate stood wide open, allowing carriages to pass in and out freely. The young man signaled to Khaled to jump off with him. They both leaped off the carriage, landing near the city's entrance. Khaled turned to him and said, "I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot." The young man simply replied, "No need to thank me, my friend. I was just as desperate as you." "That sun was brutal." Khaled asked, "Are you from Zekola?" "Yes," the young man nodded. "And you?" "You don't look like you're from around here." Khaled smiled. "Yeah, I'm from FOREK. It's a town near Mansoura." A look of shock appeared on the young man's face. "What?" Khaled quickly corrected himself. "I mean Egypt. I'm from Egypt. The young man's confusion didn't fade. He asked, "What do you mean by Egypt? Is it in the north?" Khaled, now astonished, replied, "You don't know Egypt? The mother of the world?" The young man shook his head. "No, brother, I don't know it." Khaled fell silent, deep in thought. Then, as if trying to ease his own bewilderment about these strange people he was meeting, he answered, "Yes, Egypt is in the north." Then he asked, "Where are we?" The young man responded, "Don't you see, brother? We're in Zekola, the land of intelligence." Khaled couldn't hold back his laughter. "Land of intelligence? Yeah, I can really see that in everyone I've met so far." Then he asked again, "So, which country does it belong to? What region?" The young man seemed rushed. "I don't understand your question. It's simply Zekola, nothing more." Then he added, "I must leave now. I've already wasted a whole day of work, and I need to make up for it." He extended his hand to bid farewell, and Khaled shook it. "My name is Khaled." The young man replied, "And I am Yaman. Good luck in the land of Zekola." With that, he left. Khaled remained standing in front of the city's massive gate. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment he crossed through the gate, a powerful tremor ran through his body. A searing pain erupted in his head, as if it were being split apart. He collapsed onto his knees, clutching his head in agony. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. The pain lasted for minutes, then slowly faded away, as if nothing had happened. Gathering himself, he continued walking into the city. As he wandered through its streets, it felt like stepping into a dream. He observed the people around him, their faces reflecting a range of emotions. Some smiled cheerfully, while others carried deep sorrow in their eyes. He noticed their clothing, which seemed to be divided into different styles. The elderly wore long robes with turbans on their heads. Meanwhile, the younger men and children wore wide trousers that tapered at the ankles, resembling a fisherman's outfit, but far more elegant. They paired them with loose, intricately patterned shirts made of leather or fine fabric. As for the women, they wore flowing dresses in vibrant colors, and none of them covered their heads. Khaled couldn't help but notice the beauty of many of the women in the city. He quickly averted his gaze, unsure of the customs here and how people might react. What intrigued him even more was the elegance and variety of their attire. Every young man and woman in the city looked well dressed. As he strolled through the streets, he marveled at the architecture. The buildings were tightly packed together, displaying impressive craftsmanship. None of them exceeded 3 stories in height, and they were all made of baked bricks and wood. Continuing his walk, he soon found a place that served food. His stomach growled, reminding him of his hunger. He stepped inside, sat down, and ordered a meal. A man brought him a plate of bread and meat, saying, "Thank you for honoring us with your presence, O wealthy one." Khaled smiled. "Wealthy? Again?" He ate his fill, then waited for someone to come and take his payment. But no one did. Confused, he simply got up and left. His strength was restored after the meal, and he resumed exploring the city. Soon he came across a clothing shop. Looking down at himself, he realized he needed to buy something that matched the local attire so he wouldn't stand out. He entered the shop, and the shopkeeper immediately asked, "You're not from Zikola, are you?" Khaled nodded in agreement. The man handed him a suitable outfit, wide pants and a patterned cotton shirt. Surprisingly, He didn't ask for any payment. Instead, he said the same thing as the restaurant owner. "Thank you for honoring us with your presence, O wealthy one." Khaled smiled, recalling what the two strangers in the desert had said about him being strange because he was generous. They really must be crazy, he thought to himself. What he had seen so far was an overwhelming generosity from the city's people. As he wandered through the streets in his new outfit, his eyes roamed curiously around. He noticed something strange. Every shop and marketplace had numbers and units written on them, 10 units, 5 units. He couldn't understand what these units meant. As he continued walking, night fell, and he was surprised to find that despite the city's apparent wealth, it hadn't yet been introduced to electricity. However, his astonishment grew when the entire city suddenly lit up with fire, illuminating every corner. The brightness was no less than that of the lamps he was familiar with. It was yet another marvel of engineering. He sat down at the side of one of the streets, feeling sleep creeping over him. But before he could drift off, he noticed the townspeople preparing excitedly, as if they were about to celebrate something.